Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2025 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. Um, Very hot day here in Vermont. I'm Christophe Courchaine, Faculty Director of the Environmental Law Center and Associate Dean for Environmental and Experiential Programs here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Each of our talks this summer is worth one Vermont CLE credit, so please keep track of which talks you attend for your records. We'll have time for a good discussion after today's presentation, and for those of you watching on VLGS YouTube, you may enter your questions in the chat space at any time, and we'll get through as many as we can. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Julia Sklar. Julia's one of our summer media fellows here as part of our summer environmental session. Julia is an award-winning science journalist, editor, educator, and public speaker. She also works part-time as a consulting journalist at Mississippi River Basin Ag and Water Desk, a journalism collaborative that works with Report for America Fellows to cover the largest watershed in the U.S. She previously worked as a story editor at Sierra Magazine, where she commissioned and shaped coverage of climate science, public health, and coastal issues for the print magazine and website. For many years prior to that, Julia was an independent journalist reporting for the National Geographic, the Boston Globe, Undark Magazine, and others. She's had the distinct honor of authoring the cover-to-cover contents of two themed print editions of National Geographic, one on emerging neuroscience and the other on the science of stress. And she's also taught science journalism at MIT and Johns Hopkins. Today, she will present the radioactive shadow workers of the oil and gas industry and environmental journalism perspective. So please join me in welcoming Julia Sklar.
Thank you. If I had known that that's what you were going to read, I would have made it shorter for you. I'm really happy to be here today to share this story that I commissioned and edited for Sierra Magazine. It was in our spring 2025 issue, so it came out pretty recently. Um, and basically, I wanted to bring this story in today because I think it's a really interesting example of what goes into telling uh, stories that really matter to people who care about the environment, but also as journalists, having to find a way to get people to keep caring about these ongoing issues that have been around for many, many decades. And one of those is obviously the oil and gas industry. There are so many different ways to pick apart that story, and it gets increasingly challenging, I think, to um, break through what I would describe as reader fatigue. Anytime you're tackling a massive industry or a systemic problem, that's always a challenge. But I think, especially when you're doing journalism that deals with climate change, people immediately know that they're not going to have a good time reading this story. And so we have to find ways to encourage them to come and read it anyway. In this case, what ended up happening is I got a pitch from this writer, Justin Noble, who has covered the oil and gas industry for many, many decades. He's written an entire book about it. He pitched me about a year ago wanting to write a story in this space, and we kind of came up on all of those challenges that I just mentioned, and we kept this communication going for a couple of months to try to find the way in. And the angle that we decided to take was to focus on the workers, really hinge this reporting on the stories of real people who are impacted by this incredibly toxic industry, and to use their experience as the thread to bring our reader through what could have been a really dense, really overwhelming 5,000 word story. And the other thing too was picking this industry apart from a surprising angle. So again, sort of breaking through that news fatigue that a lot of people experience. I was like, how can we cover the oil and gas industry in a way that offers something new that people have not heard of before? And what we decided to focus on was the waste that comes out of this industry and the treatment of that waste. So a lot of the coverage of the toxic impacts of the oil and gas industry focus on the primary products of that industry. This story focused on the byproduct of that industry. Um, I think if you just consider how little people think about regular trash in their everyday lives, and then dial that into an industry that is so opaque and so massive, it's this completely invisible issue. And so that was kind of the equation for how to break through some of that fatigue that I keep referencing was human stories and a surprising angle and kind of bringing those things together. And what Justin uncovered in his investigation is that the waste that comes out of oil and gas fields, the process of treating it is something that was billed to workers as a completely safe experience and also something that could sort of help like green the oil and gas industry. So you have these byproducts, mostly um, water and salt. Those are sort of the biggest byproducts from oil and gas extraction. And the industry sort of billed that you could treat the water and make it clean enough to use in agriculture. That was something that has been sold very heavily, especially in the Southwest, where irrigation is a really big issue, but also there is a huge stronghold on our national agricultural industry. So, using this treated water to kind of both remove waste from the oil and gas industry and then also provide a resource to this under-resourced industry was kind of built as this closed loop um, experience. And the other part of it was salt. And the idea was that you could treat the salt and make it safe to use in pools. So a lot of people, um, historically used chlorine to treat their pools, and there's been a big movement away from that and into a more natural way of treating pools. And one of the options is salt. And so you could go into any big box store like a Walmart, a BJ's, a Target, and you can find many different brands of pool salt that's very common for Americans to use in their home pools now. And one of the sources of that salt was billed as this waste treatment industry. So you can imagine all of the potential red flags that that raises. But the industry did a lot of work to kind of market it as this completely safe product. It was branded actually as Clorox, so a very recognizable brand that I think a lot of people trust and would um, lean towards. If you track that far enough back, it leads to this company called Eureka Resources that we cover in this story and is a direct byproduct of the oil and gas industry. But still, I mean, they weren't necessarily trying to hide the origin of the product, but to bill it as completely safe. And so basically, the sort of punchline of this story is that none of it is safe. There are huge, huge levels of radioactivity in this industry and still in the byproducts that are so called treated. And obviously, that raises a lot of concerns from a consumer safety and health perspective. But even that was still, there was a lot of coverage of that maybe about 5, 10 years ago, was still sidelining the workers who were sort of the frontline exposure to these things and had not received any safety trainings, letting them know that this was a potential outcome of the work that they were doing. They were not provided proper PPE, and many of these folks, once they left the industry, started developing cancer and other pretty major chronic health issues. A lot of these folks were young and otherwise healthy when they went into the industry. The story opens with um, can everyone see my screen, by the way? It says screen sharing is paused, so I don't know.
I think that we will get that screen up for everyone.
Well, so the story starts with this guy called Nick Fisher, and he, I believe, is 38 when we meet him in the story, and he's dealing with a host of chronic health issues. He has trouble breathing, he's completely lost his appetite. He has lost 40 pounds without trying. When we meet him, he's sitting around a campfire talking to his friends about what has happened to him and also about his fear and anxiety about speaking out about the work that he did and the health impacts that he's now living with. He deals also with chronic fatigue, so it's very hard for him to hold down other jobs. So he's essentially living in a forced state of poverty that he wasn't living in prior. And his friends are really encouraging him to speak out in spite of the risks because he's already living with so many risks as it is. And I think what was so useful to me as an editor to receive reporting like this that really brings you in on the front end to somebody's lived experience is we then get to follow Nick throughout the rest of the story, which makes some of these bigger systemic issues, I think, a little bit easier to trace because we're just hearing about them first through the lens of a layperson's experience on the job. And then we can go a little bit deeper and define terms and talk about the science and talk about legislation. And there's a possibly relevant to this audience, there's this sort of key series of lawsuits that's in the middle of this story. Well, one of the things that comes up a lot in this story is how difficult it is to do attribution science. So we have these people who we know worked in these industries, we know were healthy going in, and we now know are living with chronic issues and sort of dropping like flies, so to speak, in the sort of decade or two after leaving this industry. But knowing those things is not enough to be able to point to this work that they did as the reason why they had those health outcomes. And it's especially difficult in Appalachia, which is where this whole story takes place, mostly in Pennsylvania, and then some parts of West Virginia. Um, and then times it branches out into Ohio and Kentucky, but most of it is like really rooted in Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania. There is this baseline carcinogenic risk that everyone living there, regardless of the work that they're doing, is exposed to on a daily basis because of the presence of these industries, again, whether or not they're directly working with them. And so it just makes it, I think, really difficult scientifically to come up with this burden of proof to be able to concretely say this person has terminal cancer because they did this job. And that is a loophole that is often exploited and continues to put workers in these positions. The other thing that's kind of interesting that I think also kind of helped tell the story is the sort of whack-a-mole experience of dealing with these companies. So they open these waste treatment plants. A lot of times they're only open for 2 years, maybe 3 years, and then they close and they move to a different site or they reopen in the same site under a completely different name with completely different ownership. And it can make it really difficult, especially where legal action is concerned, to trace back who actually caused these issues and who should be held accountable. The other issue, and this is both a legal issue and also a scientific issue, is the workers who were in these plants and were exposed to many of these um, radioactive materials oftentimes sort of disappear from the system once they stop doing these jobs. And so it can make it very difficult to find people to trace for the long term to look at public health outcomes. And it can also make it really hard to sort of collect a robust group of plaintiffs because these people are very hard to find. And so there's that mixed with what Nick was talking to his friends about. The people you can find are also just afraid to speak out because they're just, regular people who just went to work and came home with cancer, basically. So I think, part of the challenge in telling this story is threading all those needles, as it were, and keeping it straight as you move through the story, especially with this issue of businesses either changing names halfway through the story, or some of them also use very similar names. So Clearwater shows up a lot in this story, and there were two different companies that used that name in their company name, but they were actually completely different companies. And so I think, that kind of reporting is super important, but also can be very challenging from a storytelling perspective because we want to make sure that people are keeping it straight. And so, one of the easiest ways that we were able to do that was by having people like Nick. There's also towards the end of the story a couple of other characters who come into it, and we can remind folks like this plant we're talking about here is the one that Nick worked at, and you might remember that more than you would remember, that was the plant that was in this city and open from 2008 to 2012. I think having the empathy be the thread that helps people keep track of details was something that worked really well in this story. And that actually was not present in the first draft when Justin turned it in. So it was something that we worked really hard on together. The other thing that we worked on was actually taking Justin out of the story. So this is something, in my fellowship here that I've been finding really interesting is the overlap in methodology between what journalists do and what lawyers do. So we had this story that Justin is so, so close to. He, grew up in these areas. He's been reporting on these things for decades. He has physically been to many of these sites. We also had a couple of studies referenced in the story that he helped do. Like he helped take the samples, water samples, soil samples, and get them tested. So he's very present in this story. And when the first draft came in, there was a lot of first person actually going on here. And I think for me, I've been an editor, I've also been a reporter. I totally understand why that's the first inclination when you sit down to write something, because you're not just a reporter, you're also a human. You're on the ground with these people, you're seeing it with your own two eyes. And the easiest way to start telling the story is to say, I was here, I saw this, I talked to this person. But as far as doing good journalism is concerned, I kind of was like, not only is the story not about you, it's about the workers, but also just because you saw this thing doesn't mean that it's true the way that you saw it. We need to find the proof, we need to have evidence. And so the process of editing the story was to almost entirely actually take Justin out of the story and replace each of his I statements with a study or a quote from an expert or you know we actually also referenced some lawsuits that had happened in the past, some EPA documentation where they kind of are on the record saying they know that these substances are toxic and cause a carcinogenic risk to people who handle them. And yet there's, absolutely no regulation of them. And that I think was ultimately what made this story really strong, was kind of going through and being like, okay, for everything that you observed and are pretty sure is true, what are 2 to 3 versions of proof that we can pull in instead and reference instead? And so we had to do that basically in every paragraph. It took about 4 months to finish producing this story, and a lot of other people were involved. We had a team of fact checkers, copy editors, proofreaders. The other editors on my team also did a first read of the story to flag some of these things before Justin and I, really got into the weeds and started changing sentences and moving paragraphs around and things. But I think, that's something that maybe the average reader of journalism doesn't necessarily get to see behind the curtain of that process, and how it is that we end up picking out the evidence that we end up referencing in the story. And for everything that's referenced in the story, there's like 2 to 3 examples sitting on the cutting room floor. My inbox is just full of reports from the Department of Environmental Protection in Pennsylvania. But I really appreciated working with somebody who understood that process and was really open to having me come in and basically like jigsaw puzzle his whole draft into something new. Um, as far as like my creative experience working on this story, the part that I enjoyed the most was I'll zoom forward to the end of the story. This final paragraph in the piece where Justin got this absolutely incredible quote from the CEO of Eureka Resources, which is the company I mentioned earlier, um, was selling pool salts branded as Clorox that came from oil and gas field waste treatment. And Justin had asked them a bunch of questions and, did his due diligence, offering them a chance to be on the record and, speak from their own perspective or try to defend the company in some way. And the CEO responded to the email in a way that was clearly meant to be private and internal, but forgot to take Justin off the email. And so he ended up just getting this absolutely incredible quote um, that I'll read. It goes, "Once you engage with these crackpots," he wrote, "they just keep digging at you until they get whatever sensational data or information that they are after to get eyeballs on their publications. Let him write his stupid piece." And we just ended with that quote. And what's so interesting to me is when I got the draft, this was actually buried in the middle of the story as this kind of funny aside, but sort of inconsequential to the piece. And I was like, no, this is the kicker. Like, we have to end on this note because I think that it just shows I think it just shows what we're all up against when we talk about these things. And it was such an incredible sort of accidental get that came out of this email chain that he was not supposed to be on anymore. But it feels like kind of a mic drop to end the story with let him write his stupid piece. And he did. And I think I'm really proud of this work. We got a lot of really good feedback from readers that, it's not a fun story to read, but it's a good story. Like, it has the kind of rise and fall that you would expect from almost a piece of nonfiction writing. Really good quotes, really good scenes. And so I think in the end, um, we were able to break through some of those challenges that you're confronting constantly when you're doing environmental journalism. And I think I'll just say two more things and then we can kind of open it up to a conversation. But the other thing I think this reporter did really well was um, having a really diverse set of sources. So I was saying that we kind of anchored the arc of the story on the workers, but they were not the only voices in the story. We also have Katie Muth, who's a state senator in Pennsylvania, and really the only politician who's championing any kind of protection for workers in this industry or accountability in this industry. Um, we had a bunch of former EPA officials who were able to speak really candidly about just the total lack of regulation on this industry. It's not regulated the way that we regulate nuclear waste or medical waste, which is honestly crazy. It's completely exempt from all of that. Um, and then we also talked to the families of some of the people who had worked in this industry and have passed away. So those workers were not able to speak for themselves, but there's one person's wife is in this story, and she's able to sort of speak to the community impact that these profound losses have. It's not just the worker who's impacted, it's their families, it's their communities. And so I think having all of those voices in this story, and then of course also giving an opportunity to the executives who work in this industry to speak for themselves, you end up with this really balanced narrative that I think still accomplishes what Justin tried in the first draft through his own kind of eye-centered reporting. But this way, I think you come away feeling, um, I think, just a little more trusting of the information that you've been given because you're hearing the same thing from so many different people, from different perspectives, from different parts of the country. And I think that that just works so much better in the end to really have someone walk away being convinced that this is a problem. And the last thing I'll say, we covered so much in this piece and we accomplished so much, but in the end, it was a print story, and so we had limited space and we weren't able to cover everything. And one of the things that we had to cut out of the story that I am still so horrified by and would love to work with another reporter, work with Justin again to cover this, is that we focused on the oil and gas waste treatment that's happening domestically. So products that are arising out of domestic oil and gas extraction and then treated here as well. But there's this other side industry where the US actually imports this waste from other countries that are so aware of the carcinogenic risk that they will not expose their own citizens to the treatment of it. So they send it here and we do it here and we expose our people to it. So that to me is sort of, it was outside the scope of this particular story, but is so, it's like the cherry on top of a horrifying layer cake. And so I hope that, if I don't have a chance to work with someone who's covering this, that other people are able to cover this because inside of an already sort of invisible problem inside of a too big to fail industry, there's like this even more invisible sub issue. So I hope some attention will go to that in the future.
Terrific. Thank you, Julia, for presenting this piece and bring it to our collective attention as a community. I think it's incredibly powerful from all different angles that you spoke to, and it's as you say, it's an untold story that is not on the not in the headlines. In the way that some other corporate depredations may be, but it's no less one. So I think we have plenty of time to have a bit of a conversation about your work and your journalism and your editing and this piece, and as well as lots of chance for folks who are online watching to ask questions. Um, you can enter your questions or your comments on the YouTube page that you're watching, if you're watching live, along the right-hand side of the page. Um, Earlier, I posted a link to the story so that folks can take a look at it and read it. It's a healthy read, but it is in terms of time, but it's well worth your time. It's a pretty compelling piece. That really bears that extended attention, which these feature stories in print magazines have historically provided us. And our fractured attention has often dissuaded us from engaging in. So I really encourage you to take a look at that and read it fully. But in the meantime, let's sort of open the discussion, Julia, in thinking about this project. Sort of how did you how was the reaction to it that you've observed over the last few months as it's been out in the world? And has that met your expectation? Have you hoped for more? How does it fit into the overall sort of, I guess, discourse around this particular industry's sort of corporate responsibility? It was fascinating how the piece included all these references to these greenwashing techniques on this topic. And yeah, how has this been received?
Yeah, I think the folks who have read it and have written in, which is already sort of a subgroup within a subgroup, I think report just being horrified. Like it's just really difficult to learn about things that are happening every day all around you that you don't know about. And I think that that was a very human reaction that a lot of people were having to this story. Um, it's kind of I think the reaction was different in comparison to other stories I've worked on that are more about the primary products of the oil and gas industry, where people are still upset to learn about the impact that that work has on people who are working directly with those products. But there is this tendency to be like, but we need oil and gas, so it's the cost of doing business, so to speak. Not that I personally agree with that, but I think that that is sort of the reaction that people tend to have. With this story, I think the reaction was so much like, we don't even need these things at all. Like, just hearing about the waste that is produced is something that really got a lot of people, and they were really stuck on that. I would say, though, broadly, I don't feel like we got the reaction that I was expecting from a story like this. Like, I thought we would hear from some of the companies for sure in this piece. It's not uncommon for PR folks to reach out and try to pick apart all your facts, and that's why you have to have your documentation ready to go. That's why we have fact checkers, so that when that happens, we're ready and we can kind of refute all of their claims. Um, obviously, if they point out an actual inaccuracy, we would listen to that. But we really didn't get that response, which I'm still sort of curious about. I don't know what to make of it. Um, but that was the part of the response that I was expecting that we didn't get. I don't know, maybe we just did such a good job. There was nothing they could possibly pick apart.
Well, it has both the elements of the human stories of these workers, but also really for the environmental law aficionados on the call today on this talk, there is a richness to this in terms of environmental law that wanted to sort of ask you about a little bit, which is, we've got um, really this oil and gas exceptionalism that's built into federal and state law that really exempts a lot of activities that are dangerous from sort of legal scrutiny. The standard hazardous waste protocols, for example, in this particular instance where this waste material has a specific exemption that Congress put in place under RCRA, which is a very powerful statute and an example of something that broadly environmental law has done well, which is control a lot of different streams of hazardous waste that have historically been wreaking havoc on all kinds of populations and inculcating the whole environmental health and safety ethos of many industries comes out of that law and the way that it's sort of been implemented, and materials have to be manifested, they need to be tested, they need to be properly disposed of. And it seems like this is just a um, Wild West on this particular type of waste. And wonder if that sort of came up in your reporting or discussions, the Justin's reporting or your research into this topic, that this is one of those instances of an industry having a lot of political power to the extent that some of these known impacts, um, these known massive harms, um, are just sort of legislated away, through some of these exemptions. I'm wondering, and we can talk next about how that sort of manifests in terms of private liability, in the sort of court system for private lawsuits, but wondering how you reacted or thought about that federal exemption that the industry has here.
Yeah, so what's interesting for me to now be at this fellowship is I almost wish I had done the fellowship before I had edited this story, but in some ways it's kind of informed the things that I came here being interested to learn about. So like I'm taking the environmental justice class where we are talking about these exemptions. In this story, it's the Benson and Bevel amendments that he references that define radioactive oil and gas waste as non-hazardous, even though scientifically we know that it is, which just as a human makes me feel like I'm going insane. um, and that's been true since I think 1980 is the year that he cites in the story. It's a really long time. And I think part of what was a challenge for me to edit this story was sort of couching my humanity as I was learning these things. I'm sitting here just thinking, how could that possibly be true? And it is. And so talking about the impacts of something while having to sort of skirt around the logic issues that are inside what you're describing to people is a challenge, especially because the audience that we're writing for is a lay audience. They're not people who necessarily have um, a law background who either know these things are true or understand how they've come to be true. Um, what's interesting about Sierra's audience is that it's a pretty highly educated audience. It's also one that's like very bought into environmental issues. We never have to have a story that starts at the point of being like climate change is real and humans are causing it. Which, depending on what publication you're working for, sometimes you still have to have those paragraphs in a piece. So I consider myself lucky getting to edit a story like this for that kind of audience where we get to sort of skip ahead to step 3 of the story. But in terms of some of the legal outcomes, I felt like we had to back way up to explain these things to people, which is why we have a couple paragraphs in the piece that like define those exemption amendments and try to explain the legislative process that allowed them to be true, and kind of pulling back a little bit of how industry lobbying has led to some of these things that have like no basis in science to still be true on a legislative level. Um, which as a trained science journalist, for me, I'm just like, this makes absolutely no sense. But part of that actually, I think, helped helped both of us work on the story because Justin also, is not a lawyer and doesn't have a law background. And so our level of confusion as we were wading through some of these details, I think allowed us to explain them to a lay audience better than somebody who maybe was an expert on this topic. I mean, obviously, we were consulting experts along the way. And like I said, we had fact checkers and things like that. But just on the level of like constructing sentences, the fact that we are sort of a proxy for our audience and also not knowing about these things, I think helped us kind of bring it down to a language level that is accessible to any audience, which I'm pretty proud of. The other part of the story that gets a little bit more into law is I'm trying to find it in the piece just so I can remember the guy's name. Stuart Smith, an attorney in New Orleans. And he had filed a ton of lawsuits against Shell and Chevron, Exxon, on behalf of workers at those companies. That were trying to create a legal precedent for linking lethal cancers with the work that they had done. And what I found really interesting about that reporting is it kind of did offer the counter to some of the hurdles in science that I was mentioning. So, like these longitudinal studies where you're trying to do cancer attribution studies where you're trying to figure out somebody was exposed to this over here. Is that what caused their cancer over here 10 years later? Um, those studies are still ongoing. We don't have that evidence yet for the people who were working at the companies that we were focusing on. And all of that happened kind of in the mid 2010s. And so it's probably going to be another 15 or 20 years before we have that scientific information. And I don't mean to sound callous by saying this, but many of the people will probably be gone by then because of the cancers that they're now living with. And so it just creates this sort of vacuum of information, and law can move a little faster there. And so some of these cases that Stewart brought, and many of which he won, create that precedent before science can, and then they can kind of support each other and feed off of each other, which I think is a really cool example of industries working in parallel on the same problems, but having a totally different set of tools to address those problems. And where one moves really slowly, the other one could move a bit more quickly. And those are pros and cons for different reasons. But I think for me working on this story, that was one of the more interesting components of it, was that there's not just, one one element, one advocacy element out there like beating this drum. We've got lawyers in the mix, we've got health practitioners in the mix, and we've also got a very small handful of politicians who are trying to deal with this at the legislative level as well. And I think we need all of those things. I don't think any one of those tools would work well on its own, and they just accomplish totally different things.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And there's a part of it that um, is very challenging to get your mind around when you have a problem like this that has been going on, in this sort of legal shadow, where there is potential tort-based liability for these companies to treat their workers this way. But the regulatory systems have stepped back and sort of are letting this happen. Um, and yeah, I wonder if you could provide a sense from your vantage point of how the policy discussion that might result in greater regulation of this um, sort of problem, where workers are getting exposed to just terrible materials on a regular basis. You have a sense of where the policy might go, or might be possible, especially given the fact that it feels like the power alignment at the moment is pretty much diametrically opposed to confronting this type of challenge in a rigorous science-based way with um, you know industry participation and um, sort of the right mix of advocacy and public concern. Where are we today in that discussion?
I have a pretty pessimistic outlook on that. I mean, one of the things in the story that is so, it's just so heartbreaking to hear is like there literally is one politician who's working on this. It's State Senator Katie Muth from Pennsylvania. And what's interesting is that she actually represents Philadelphia. She doesn't represent any districts in the western part of the state where this work is going on, though she grew up in that area. So I think from that perspective, the issues are very close to her heart. But I've had the pleasure of speaking to her myself, actually. Justin and I did an event with I always forget the acronym. It's the Society for Socially Responsible Physicians or something like that. I can't remember exactly what the organization is called. But she also was on that webinar, and she's just such a fire hose of information and also just totally unfiltered in a way that I found really, really refreshing from a politician. And I think at the end of the day, it's like, we need more politicians who are not taking money from the oil and gas industry, which is funding so many people's campaigns and then makes them kind of hamstrung to not speak out on behalf of workers being harmed by those industries. And then you have someone like Katie Muth, who's not beholden to anybody, doesn't honestly give a shit, was not like, born and bred to be a politician, and she just very literally is speaking truth to power. What's also so interesting about her actually is that the district in Philadelphia that she represents is a red district in Philadelphia, and she has um, beaten out, or first she beat out a Republican incumbent, and then she was reelected after that. She's not up for election until 2028, I think. And I think that some of that also just gives her the confidence to say the truth, because she has proven that, you can get elected in a district that would maybe historically you would think would vote a different way. And that also somebody who represents a district that is not on the primary front lines of a problem can still speak out for constituents in other parts of the state. Because at the end of the day, especially from like an environmental science perspective, you might say, "Oh, I don't live in Western Pennsylvania, so this is not a problem for me." But that's really not how any of these systems work. And so, like, the district that she represents has a pipeline running through it that is actually bringing the primary product that's created in Western Pennsylvania through her district and onward out into the Atlantic and to Europe. And so I think her ability to kind of connect the dots like that for her constituents and kind of get them to care about something that does impact them but might be sort of hidden from view, I think is really powerful. And I wish we had more politicians who were doing that. I can't think of anyone else really who is, so I don't have like super high hopes at the moment. But I I just keep looking to her and the work that she's doing, and it's really quite exceptional.
She does seem quite the bright spot in a very dark picture of the policy landscape for this. Um, I'm wondering if you could maybe put this piece in the context, um, you know, it fits very powerfully in the context of prior accountability journalism focused on sort of you know untold industry um, risks to the public that really goes back um, to Silent Spring or even earlier in terms of raising awareness about a significant set of public health or environmental problems that industry denies, at the time. And um, how do you put this issue in that context, and specifically of accountability work that's been done both journalistically and from an advocacy perspective with respect to the fossil fuel industry, which certainly has, you know, come in for a variety of different campaigns over the last decade or more, and how you see this issue, which to me strikes me as a really powerful issue for the workers of these companies, how it fits into that history.
Well, it's interesting that you asked that because I'm actually reading Silent Spring for the first time right now. I've in my lifetime like encountered excerpts of it and people reference it all the time. And it was just sometime around Earth Day this year where all of a sudden I was like, I've actually never like sat down and truly read this book. So I'm doing that right now. I'm like three-quarters of the way done. And my impression of it is both hopeful in some ways. Like I'm really now is a really difficult time to work in any space that's allied with environmental protections of any kind, um, or even not, even just to be a regular person just consuming the news and just worried about the future. It's a really difficult time. And there are moments when I'm reading that book where I'm like, it's actually so amazing, all the things that we've accomplished since this book was written, and all of the threats that are no longer concerns because of advocacy writing like this. And that has brought me actually a lot of hope. But then on the other hand, I have this feeling of like the goalpost just keeps moving. So it's like, okay, we are not dealing with the pesticides that she's talking about in this book, but like we're currently seeing the glyphosate issue play out in real time in front of us. So like, big companies just went and created a different pesticide and continued to gaslight people into thinking that it wasn't a problem. So I'm kind of of two minds right now, being steeped in this book, and trying very hard for my own mental health to lean into the first inclination of being proud about how much has been done. Um, but I think the advocacy part of it is always a tricky one for journalists to navigate. There's this very rich, consistently evolving conversation in the industry about bias and neutrality and things like that. And I've kind of watched that shift throughout the course of my own career. And a lot of it, I think, is for the best. I don't think we do any favors to anybody by pretending that neutrality can exist. We all have our own perspectives. We all have biases. Historically, what neutrality in journalism has meant is just that the white male college educated perspective is the neutral perspective, which of course is not true. That's its own bias. So it's been really hopeful for me to work in the industry at a time where there are a lot of people really at the front lines of redefining how to ethically do this work and where the boundaries of your personal perspective are versus the story that you're trying to tell. And where this story, I think, fits into that is kind of what I was talking about at the beginning, that, I have this story from somebody who is so personally invested in this topic and it's all he covers. So he feels really, really passionately about it. And I think that's a really good way to come into something and figure out what it is that you want to cover. That's how most journalism starts, is you just have a person in the world who sees something and they're like, that's not right. There's something off there. And then they start digging into it. And I don't think we should shy away from that inclination. That's how really good stories get told. But how you then present that to the public, I think you do have to be very careful about how you're constructing the narrative so that somebody comes away having enough information to be able to come to their own conclusion. But of course, that conclusion is something that we have crafted in some way, right? Like we could have quoted different people in this story. We could have cited other studies. We chose the ones that we chose because we are trying to craft a specific argument. And I don't think that journalists should pretend that they're not doing that, but we need to do it carefully and show you the scaffold. So that's why we've like named the studies. We've told you who these people are. We don't have anonymous sources, just to show you like this conclusion that we're presenting you with is this is how we came to the conclusion. And I think, people are still free to disagree or get to the end of the story and have a different conclusion or read into it differently. And that's just a byproduct of creating media. But it is an interesting time to be doing, especially environmental reporting, because it does feel like the stakes are so high for all of us as humans on this planet to be kind of kowtowing to some sense of neutrality and then leaving really, really real and harmful impacts on the table because we're afraid to just point at them and call them what they are. So it's something that I think about a lot as an editor, especially like right now, this year specifically.
Um, Another sort of thread that comes out of this type of story that I think is fascinating to environmental policymakers and lawyers is this concept of sort of health risk how we account for it. And there's different examples, of the way that the law has treated sort of health risks associated with various industrial activities. And it really does run the gamut from, a substance like asbestos, although apparently we're going to legalize that again. But asbestos being a particular cause of a very particular set of diseases that manifest later in life, and there's broad scientific agreement that those illnesses are caused by exposure to asbestos, and so that's a real justification for very stringent requirements, whether they be at the federal or in many cases at the state level, on the use and management of asbestos. And then we read all the gamut to your story, where regulators have stepped back and are not even really thinking about those risks given these exemptions and other things. There's this vast middle area where we're dealing with, other types of chemicals and the risks they pose at different concentrations. Some are short-term risks, some are long-term risks. We have plastics. We were talking about plastics a week or so ago in the Hot Topics lecture series, and we were thinking about the health risks associated with plastics and the science evolving on that. It's all tied. A lot of this is tied up in our use of fossil fuels and for all kinds of things. But I wonder, as you think of us as a science journalist, um, conveying that to the public in a way that acknowledges this issue of risk and how we are all managing it differently in different contexts, and the law handles it differently in different contexts, but that we are, recognizing the reality that we're going through life with some pretty significant unmanaged risks that were, need to be characterized and managed. And we have a very mixed approach to it across our society.
I think with science, the issue is not dissimilar to law, although correct me if I'm wrong. Like, we know that radium is carcinogenic. We have known that for almost a century at this point, and yet we still have to scientifically prove that radium is still carcinogenic when it comes from this particular product in this particular industry in this particular exposure. And that's why these studies that I mentioned that are, maybe 2 to 3 years in the works right now and will take another couple of decades to come out have to happen, because it's not enough to be like, oh, well, you know, the women who were painting those glow in the dark clocks, they all ended up with jaw cancer from licking their paintbrushes and were exposed to radium. Like, we can't just point to that and be like, okay, now these people who work to create pool salts from oil and gas waste are also having the same problem. We can't do that. I think where science journalism differs is we can kind of still provide that. We can say, you would have to do it in a really careful way. We could say something along the lines of like, radium is known to cause these outcomes in these exposures, and scientists are currently studying if that's the case in this industry as well. And so you can kind of, offer to the best of your ability a previous example that shows a precedent, but it wouldn't be, I think, ethical to go so far as to then come to my own conclusion that science has not yet come to. I still need to couch those conclusions in fact and in experts who are doing this work, even if we're all sitting around here just talking as lay people, being like, yeah, of course, radium causes cancer in any context. That's just how it works. But we can't print that. So I think that's kind of where science journalism can maybe move. Actually, I think this is another good example of like different industries working in parallel on the same issues. Like, journalists can move faster, I think, than lawyers who can move faster than scientists. And we all need to work together. And that's why having these expert sources in these stories is so important. And also, I will say, as a science journalist, when I reach out to scientists for comment on things, or even just to like gut check something, be like, I read this study and I interpreted it this way. Does that make sense to you? Um, I have almost never encountered somebody who didn't want to talk, because I think a lot of scientists are so specialized and just kind of are out there doing their thing, assuming that nobody cares or understands what they're doing. And there's a genuine excitement when somebody comes knocking on their door and is like, I care. I want to talk about what you're doing. And so they make really good allies, I think, for the work that I am then doing. It's a little bit different in different industries. So, like, for this story, like Justin calling up like the CEOs of the companies or wanting to talk to other politicians who weren't Senator Muth, those are the sources who tend to be less interested in talking or a little bit more scripted when you speak to them. But scientists make amazing sources. They're so excited to talk, and they're so game to help you kind of parse these really complicated studies and draw conclusions from things that are maybe not yet peer reviewed, but are out there to create hypotheses around. And we can provide all of that to our reader. But again, you just have to be really careful about the language that you use, because you don't want to go so far as to say that something is true when it maybe is just a supposition at this point. But you can still provide the sort of collection of previous science that would help somebody come to that conclusion.
Well, this has been fascinating, and I think very. I think a lot of lawyers in the environmental space are deeply inspired and motivated by science and environmental journalism, and many law students that I speak to and graduate students cite some instance of, I saw this story and I couldn't get it out of my head and I needed to do something about it. And so that's why they're engaged in getting a law or policy degree. And so the work that goes into putting together a piece like this is so powerful. And I think I'll just say that there is a something really important at the core of this, that um, the workers being such an important set of stakeholders in these discussions that are really completely absent when we talk to management of these companies, or some of their experts, some of their lawyers. It's like there's this massive workforce um, that really deserves a lot of attention and consideration as we think about our, next steps in the energy transition, as we think about um, how to manage these health risks to protect those workers. Really, really important part of the discussion, and oftentimes one that we, um, are thinking about very simplistically. And I think what this story does is it captures a lot of the richness of that human experience really well. So kudos to you and to Justin on that, on the piece and other work that you've been doing. I think we're essentially out of time for our discussion today, which really, really enjoyed. And thank you very much, Julia, for presenting this to the community and sharing your thoughts and observations. And our next talk will take place online this Thursday, so please join us then. Have a wonderful day, everyone.